that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, look, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to commend much of what has been said by previous members, and particularly the member for Latrobe, who, as a part of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Security and Intelligence, of which I'm chair, contributed greatly to our deliberations of this legislation. Let there be no mistake, today is testament to the fact that the committee of which I chaired has provided a ringing endorsement to this legislation, an absolutely ringing endorsement. What was provided to us by the Attorney-General, of course with the imprimatur of the Prime Minister, was a A-grade piece of legislation in an extraordinarily difficult area. Yes, there are regimes around various state jurisdictions that relate to post-sentence detention, most particularly for sexual and violent offenders. But for the federal government to extend post-sentence detention, very importantly in our view and thankfully in the view of this parliament, to terrorist offenders is something that many thought was so difficult, so hard, that it wasn't worth pursuing. But it took our Attorney-General and Prime Minister to absolutely put their stamp on this legislation, and I want to thank them for showing that leadership, because nothing is more important, and this is said in a very glib way in this parliament, but nothing is more important than the safety and security of our citizens. And we are dealing with a phenomenon now, a phenomenon of terrorism, homegrown terrorism in many cases, that we've struggled to react to, not just us in Australia, but we've struggled to react to it throughout the Western world. The old thinking, very reasonably, was that you did the crime and you did your time, and then you left incarceration. What we have seen time and time again, not only in Australia but throughout the world, is that many terrorist offenders, due to the ideological beliefs that they hold, enter jail with that insidious ideology, and they leave even worse. They're not rehabilitated in prison. They leave even worse. They leave posing an even greater threat to our society, an even greater threat to honest, ordinary men and women in our society. And we've seen it time and time again here in Australia. We have seen it time and time again. Those where a terrorist offence occurs and people like my parents, ordinary Australians, would say, how come we weren't able to stop them? It seems so obvious that that person was radicalised. It seems so obvious that that person was embarking on a path of destruction and seeking to hurt fellow Australians. And this regime is, in a sense, a last resort. It's a backstop. It's a last resort for the worst cases of terrorist offenders who, with a high degree of probability, are determined by a court, not the government, not the Attorney-General, but determined by a court, to be such a risk to our society that they must continue to be detained. And I think the vast bulk of Australians will applaud this parliament today. And I'm very pleased that when this piece of legislation came before the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, that our committee was able to reflect the views of that community. And we, in the process of reviewing the legislation, received submissions, 18 submissions, if I recall correctly. And one of the things that struck me was that perhaps there is still a segment of our society, quite a scary segment in my view, who disagree with legislation, in my view, extraordinary though it is, as sensible as this. We've just heard comments in the Senate from the Greens who have opposed this legislation. We had submissions from the Council for Civil Liberties, who said under no circumstances could they ever support a post-sentence detention regime. We had representatives from the Muslim Legal Network who effectively said the same thing. Under no circumstances, even if we knew somebody was very likely to seek to do fellow Australians harm, even then they wouldn't support this regime. So I want to thank members opposite. I in particular want to thank my Deputy Chair, the member for Holt, for his counsel and great support during the review that we undertook. Indeed, I want to thank most of the members of the committee for the wonderful work that they did in ensuring that we were able to come up with 24 recommendations. And may I say, yes, there were 24 recommendations, but in most cases those recommendations, in my view, were just performing a function that our committee should, which is just another pair of eyes. And we sought clarifications of certain aspects of the explanatory memorandum, and we, in a sense, had only a handful of substantive amendments, which I think is great credit to the Attorney-General. The biggest amendment that we proposed, which our committee unanimously presented, was that a 10-year sunset clause be placed on this legislation. Now, my view, public view, private view, is that this phenomenon of terrorism, this phenomenon of individuals who are beyond, unfortunately, redemption, beyond rehabilitation, will not go away in 10 years. This will be with us for a lot longer than 10 years, but the committee felt that a 10-year sunset clause was a sufficient period of time to, in a sense, develop through the working group all of the additional work that will need to be done before applications for continuing detention orders can be applied for, a period of time where we can examine how the regime is working, and then that 10 years there will be a body of evidence and hopefully a body of cases where we've successfully been able to detain terrorist offenders, where we can then examine the legislation and see where, if any places, it needs to change. Because I don't think this is a problem that's going away in 10 years, but we felt as a committee that that was very necessary. Some broader comments I want to make, more in relation to the conduct of our inquiry, which is of course relevant to the legislation before us, is the extraordinarily important way in which the PJCIS is a bipartisan committee. We are dealing each and every day with legislation that goes to the most fundamental aspects of the safety and security of Australians. It's so important. And to date, the composition and membership of that committee has supported that endeavour of bipartisanship. Now, there have been moments in the process of this review, some unfortunate conduct from the Shadow Attorney-General, some unfortunate conduct of leaking information from the committee, speaking to the media inappropriately. I think the Shadow Attorney-General has conceded that he regrets that conduct, and I'd hope that in future, noting that he does regret the way that he has acted in some parts of this review, that going forward we can get assurances from him that he will live up to the standard of the other members in the Labor Party who sit on that committee. The other members of the Labor Party on that committee, because in the conduct of this review he did not live up to those high standards. So that is a very important point, that as a committee we are together as a parliament. We are not there as partisan warriors for one side or another. We are not there with a blind hatred or a single-minded focus on trying to destroy our political opponents. We are there to develop legislation and to review legislation, I should say, that keeps Australians as safe as possible. And I think this legislation does that. I'm very, very pleased to be supporting this legislation. Can I say another aspect of it which took a lot of attention were those who questioned the need for a post-sentence detention regime because we have control orders. And control orders are those where our security agencies in effect monitor and keep a very close eye on particular individuals and groups. Now, the public evidence from the Australian Federal Police and other agencies is that control orders are extraordinarily intensive, both from a resource perspective, a human resource perspective, but financially as well. Many, many millions of dollars to keep an eye on a high-risk terrorist offender in the community. And even then, even with all that cost and even with all those resources, even when a control order is in place, we cannot provide the community with 100% assurance of protection. The greatest and saddest recent example is that of the terrorist offender in France who slit the throat of a priest on the altar, killing that priest and injuring 2 other people. That person was subject to a French version of a control order. He was wearing an electronic bracelet on his ankle. He was being monitored by the police. But just by being monitored, or by being monitored itself, didn't prevent him from being able to detain, kidnap and ultimately commit a ghastly terrorist act. So this post-sentence detention regime is the best way that this parliament can say with absolute certainty that individual is so dangerous we are going to keep them detained. And we can provide the community with 100% assurance that that person will not be able to harm anybody for so long as they are detained. That's why this is so important. And what that also means is, for the absolute worst offenders, instead of our security agencies spending vast amounts of resources, as I said, human resources and financial resources in monitoring those individuals and groups, they can put those resources into other important endeavours to keep our society safe. Because it's not just a matter of throwing more money at it, as was provided to us in public hearings, because the individuals, the skill, the human intelligence, the human resources within the AFP are stretched. And if we don't act, or if we didn't act to ensure that these types of terrorist offenders are not detained, then we would not be doing them a service and we would ultimately be jeopardising the safety of our society. So can I say, I think this, on the last sitting day of the year, should be a very proud day for everybody in this parliament, perhaps minus the Greens, and I want to commend the opposition for supporting it. This is an area where it's important that we maintain bipartisanship. We've done it today. This is very hard. This is very novel legislation, and the fact that we've been able to do it and do it in a timely fashion, as requested by our security agencies who said we want this as soon as possible, is a great testament to the parliament. But most of all, to the Attorney-General, to the Prime Minister, I want to thank them for absolutely giving us their imprimatur with this legislation. This is hard, but they've delivered it today, and I look forward to the implementation working group over coming months, developing the framework that's going to make sure that this is not just good legislation in principle, that this is good legislation that sits on a shelf somewhere, but can practically be used by our security agencies to keep the worst terrorist offenders behind bars, because that is the way in which we can give Australians a categoric assurance that those individuals will not do our society harm. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.